This week is our first week of macroeconomics notes. So we're going to start out by looking at some of the major economic indicators. The first three are GDP growth rate, unemployment rate, and inflation rate. So GDP, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in the notes later today. GDP, gross domestic product, is a major indicator for how well the economy is doing. It basically counts up the total output of goods and services. But on this slide, it's looking at GDP growth rate. So in other words, how fast is our GDP growing from one year to the next? What we would like to see is 2 to 3% growth for the United States. Unemployment is a calculation which we'll talk about, I think, next week, where we look at a very specific definition of what percentage of our labor force is unemployed. And what we want for unemployment is about a 4 to 5% unemployment rate, which is considered the natural rate of unemployment. And then inflation, we would like to be at about 1 to 3%. We do not actually want 0% inflation. Deflation is actually very, very dangerous. And so we definitely take steps to manage inflation and try to make sure that it does not get too close to 0 or negative. So those are three major numbers to know, and we'll refer back to them multiple times and go into more depth with each one. So here's a longer list of economic indicators. CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, is one of the ways that we measure inflation, and we'll look more at how that works and how the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates market baskets and price indexes. PPI is the Producer Price Index, and so that is similar to the CPI, except it looks at the prices that are faced by manufacturers or other producers. So in other words, if General Mills is facing increased prices for corn or other ingredients, then that's going to increase their cost to produce cereal. Ultimately, it's going to result in a price increase for cereal, which will be then later reflected in the CPI. So the PPI indicates future increases in the CPI. The unemployment rate, I mentioned before, GDP. The Index of Leading Economic Indicators is a collection of different indicators, different data, including things like existing home sales, which is listed there, or basically like filing for unemployment benefits. So we'll look more at that in terms of Quiz Bowl, probably, because that's where they tend to show up. The prime rate is the interest rate that banks charge their best customers, or by best I mean the ones who are lowest credit risk, the ones who they're pretty confident will pay back. So the prime rate is, generally speaking, is the lowest indexed interest rate in the country. And right now it's at about 3.5%, I think, but that's another one of the indicators that you'll want to memorize for Quiz Bowl. Existing home sales is also considered an economic indicator. That is, how's the real estate market doing? Are the houses that exist right now, the houses in our community, for example, are they selling? Is there a glut of them on the market? Or is there really high demand and sales can't keep up? So right now, existing home sales is a pretty good indicator in Minnesota, but in other places it's still lagging since the last recession. And then the strength of the dollar. We'll look more at exchange rates and how those work. When the dollar, there's always pros and cons to the dollar, so when the dollar is strong, that's good for us as consumers because we can buy a lot of imported goods and we can travel easily to other countries. But when the dollar is weak, that's actually better for our exports. So that tends to help our GDP, tends to help firms that rely on exports for sales. And last, I just put a little note, labor productivity. Labor productivity is also an economic indicator. It doesn't necessarily correlate well with the others because as labor becomes more productive, that might have our GDP grow, but it might cause actually greater unemployment because we don't need as many workers. And labor productivity is defined as outputs per unit of input, or how much an average worker can produce. Okay, so we're going to now focus a little bit on GDP, which I'm sure you've learned about before in economics. The definition of GDP is up top here. GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within an economy in a given year. In the 9th grade econ book, I believe it's defined as produced in the United States in a given year, but of course every country can have a GDP. So what gets included? We do include both goods and services. So the service provided by, for example, a real estate agent or a car salesman would be counted, as well as the sale of a new house or the sale of a car. It also includes items no matter who the final consumer is. So if it's a household that's consuming the good, or if a firm is consuming the good. So if a law firm, buys paper, right, that is included. And then also things that the government buys. Anything that's produced within our borders is included, and it also includes changes in inventories. So even though we're looking at the total market value, our emphasis is really on goods and services produced in a particular year. So if, for example, a box of cereal is produced but not sold, and so it's a change in inventory, it's actually sitting on, in a warehouse owned by General Mills, it would still count because we really want to emphasize what's produced. What does not count? This is a pretty important list. Intermediate goods do not count. So anything that is going to become part of a finished product, so for example, wool that's being sold to a company that's going to turn it into a suit, the wool itself is not counted, only the suit would count. So only final goods are counted. Purely financial transactions are also not counted. So some things that we think are going to be counted aren't, because they're merely shifts in ownership. So when you buy stock in a company, for example, that does not count because stock is not a finished good or service. When one company buys ownership of another company, that does not count, purely financial. When you receive a scholarship check, that does not count. When you spend the money to go to college and pay tuition, that does count. So purely financial, just movement of money and IOUs and stocks and bonds, those do not count. Used goods do not count. They would have been counted in the year in which they were produced. So if I buy a used car, that does not add to GDP. That car was already counted in GDP. That said, if I buy a used car at CarMax, the salesperson's time and effort, the markup that they get for their service is counted, but the value of the car is not. Black market goods are not counted. Black market goods would be anything that's actually illegal to buy and sell. So, for example, drugs would not be counted. Non-market goods are also not counted, and those are not exactly the same thing. They're not illegal. They're just not things that are actually sold in a market or where there's a price attached. So, for example, if a mother cuts her son's hair, that does not count toward GDP, even though if she took him to the barber, it would count. Okay, a little bit more on the issue of intermediate goods. Again, the wool suit. So if you look at this 5-stage production process, if you imagine, we're starting out with no value, and then when we look at the value added by the sheep ranch, when the sheep ranch raises the sheep and they take the wool, they shear the wool, right, and they sell it to the wool processor, they may sell it for $120. The sheep ranch may add $120 worth of value to the final product, but that $120 is not added in GDP. Okay, they sell it to the wool processor, who turns it into nice wool fabric, okay, and that wool processor turns around and sells it to the suit manufacturer. Again, we're not counting it, right? The wool processor added $60 in value because they sold the material for $180 and they paid $120 for it, okay, but we're not adding that yet. The suit manufacturer buys the wool for $180, produces a suit and sells it for $220. Again, it's an intermediate good. All of these are intermediate goods. The clothing wholesaler buys the suit and sells it to a retailer for $270. The retailer sells it to the final consumer for $350. So the addition to GDP is simply the $350 final price of the suit. If we added these prices all along the way, we would think the suit was actually contributing $1,140 to GDP, and it's not. Okay, really, the other way we could look at it is how much value is added at each step in the process, and you'll find that actually adds up to $350. So the easiest way to do it is just to write the final retail price of the good, and that's what gets counted toward GDP. Okay, when we are calculating GDP, there are two approaches, the expenditures approach and the income approach. And we don't spend a lot of time on the income approach, but we'll talk a little bit about the expenditures approach today. So the expenditures approach involves adding up all of the expenditures from various sectors. So C represents consumption or expenditures by households. I represents investment or expenditures by firms, and it's I sub G because it's gross investment. It's the amount of money total they're spending. You'll see the difference between gross investment and net investment in a little bit. Third is G, which stands for all government purchases. So when the government buys a finished product, a finished good or service, for example, a submarine, that would count as government purchases. And then our final category is from the foreign trade sector, so X sub N, which is what we call net exports or exports minus imports. So we add in exports but we subtract out the value of imports that are sold because they're not produced in this country. So net exports is our final category, and those four things added up count as they calculate to GDP. So I'm going to have you look at this list and think about each one. Is it included in GDP? And if it's included in GDP, which sector is it in? So you should go ahead and pause the video and see if you can answer each of these, and then I'm going to go through and give you the answers. Number one, spending $7 to attend a movie is counted in GDP, and it's part of consumption. Number two, a family spending $250,000 for a new house is counted in GDP, and it's actually counted an investment. And this is one of those little weird features of calculating GDP. Any housing, any sort of real estate that's actually new real estate building is going to be counted as investment. I'm not going to get into the reasons right here, but it's a good point to remember. Number three is not counted because the house is used. Number four is counted. It's counted as consumption. Number five is counted, government spending. Number six is not counted. It's purely financial. Number seven, not counted, purely financial. Pause again and look at the next ones. Number 8 is counted. Changes in inventories are counted as investment. Number 9, not counted, non-market. Number 10, counted as investment. Number 11, counted as consumption. Number 12, counted as investment. Number 13, not counted, purely financial. Number 14 is an interesting one. We do count it as consumption minus the value of the import. So the purchase, the addition, is basically what happens at that final stage in the production process at the retail showroom. The car itself is subtracted as an import. And then you probably couldn't see number 15. 15 is counted, it's consumption. If you look at the two different approaches, you can see the one we just did, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. The other approach, or the income approach, calculates GDP by the money earned. These two approaches should arrive at the same number because if dollars are being spent on this side, they're being earned on this side, right? A dollar spent is a dollar earned. So the income and expenditures approach should arrive at basically the same quantity of GDP. The income approach is wages plus rents plus interest plus profits. Those are the four ways, if you remember, that resources can earn income or that households earn income. But there are a few statistical adjustments, and those would be depreciation, which we'll talk about a little bit more, indirect business taxes, and net foreign factor income. So let me talk about these last two first. Indirect business taxes, when you buy a good, so for example, when a household buys a new washing machine, most of that money becomes income, right, to somebody. So some of that money goes to wages for the workers who work at the store, and some of the money might go to rents, payment on, for example, ownership of the property. Some of it might be interest to the investors in the company. So that money all becomes income to people. But some of it you pay in sales tax, right? So some of your consumption expenditure actually goes to the government instead. And so that has to be adjusted out because that's not counted as part of GDP. So when we calculate this method, one of the things we have to do is we have to subtract indirect business taxes before we look at the income side. Another one is net foreign factor income, and that is that some of the money that we're spending actually becomes income to people in other countries. And so we have to take out the income to people in other countries and then add in income that Americans earn from interests elsewhere. So net foreign factor income is another balancing factor. Okay, our last slide on this video, and then I'm going to make a brief additional video, is about depreciation. So depreciation is the consumption of fixed capital, or when you're actually using up fixed capital. So for example, if I own a bunch of computers in my business, every year those computers are going to lose value because they get old, right? They don't work as well. Keys stick, software is updated and doesn't necessarily work on that computer. So when you compare the stock of capital at the beginning of the year to the stock of capital at the end of the year, your gross investment includes all the money you actually spend on upgrading your system. But while you're spending all that money, you're actually losing value at the same time. So net investment is your gross investment minus what is lost.